Rolling. 3, 2, 1. Action. Welcome to Ho-Choka Podcast.
Hello, Mitakuye, and welcome to Ho-Choka, here at the center of St. Joseph Indian School's campus. I'm Scott Wooster. I'm joined by Hope McCloskey. And today the two of us host Joseph Marshall III, award-winning author of 18 books. He's a cultural and historical consultant, a teacher, craftsman, administrator, actor, and a public speaker. He joins us to tape for a series directed primarily to our families about the vital task of reinvigorating the cultural identity of Lakota youth. In this podcast, we talk about stories as seeds of cultural identity. And I'd just like to say welcome, Joseph.
Thank you.
It's good to have you here.
Glad to be here.
So, Joseph, my wife Lorraine and I have read most of your books. And in those, you refer to grandfather very often, the stories you heard from your grandfather, your grandparents. And it stresses the importance of their stories passed
Right.
along to you. And I'm certain that most of my influence at St. Joe's on the children I've worked with over 28 years has dealt with stories that I tell
Right.
that have some kind of lesson in them. And some of my stories are even true. But I love to tell stories,
Right.
and they just that's a great way to learn. You mentioned a seed of identity planted when children hear those cultural stories, and how a sense of self begins to grow from that seed. Can you share a short list of stories that we want to share to help the next generation? You know, some that were passed along to you or have been written down for you that'll help our listeners, Hope, myself, and.
Well, I think maybe not so much the specific stories themselves, but the kind of stories that helped me. Well, there were two kinds actually that I really enjoyed was the trickster stories or the Iktomi stories. They were funny, and the more you listen to them, then you hear the advice. You know the lesson that comes along with it. It's not just entertainment. It's learning something in the process. So there are any number of those kinds of Iktomi stories, the trickster stories. I enjoyed them a lot, and I still try to tell them as often as I can. The other kind of story is simply the story about family, about my direct ancestors. There are both sad stories and not so sad stories and happy stories, all kinds of stories about what they did, where they lived, who they were, and how they thought. Those were the kind of stories that really gave me my sense of identity, because then I could say, okay, this grandma lived here, she did this, and she was this kind of person. One of the stories that I remember is of a grandmother who was my grandmother's cousin. So she was my grandma, first cousin. Grandma Lulu, her name was. She never spoke a word of English in her life. She had the same opportunity to learn it as much as anybody else did in her generation, but she just chose not to learn it. And she was not a very tall woman, and she had this very low voice. And she had several children in her lifetime. She told me a story once. She told a story. I was there listening to it with other people about, and she lived to be almost 100 years old. And I can't remember what year she died. It had to be in the 80s that she died. So she was born somewhere in 1880 or thereabouts. So you can see where that puts her in a generational scheme.
Yeah.
So her mother was probably born about 1860. So again, there's that direct connection to the language of the way it was. But she told a story when she was a little girl. I don't know how old she was, 5 or 6, but she was at an age where she could, distinctly remember what happened. And it was in the summertime, and she and her mother and one of her sisters were walking from one place to another, from one wherever they were to visit somebody a few miles away. But it was summertime, and a storm came up, and it turned into a tornado. They saw a funnel cloud in the distance coming toward them. So she was frightened. She and her sister were frightened. But her mother said she said her mother grabbed them each by hand and ran along found a river, creek, and ran along it until she found a plum thicket. You know what plum thickets are. They're just, it's hard to get in there because it's so thick. And she had them crawl into the thicket, to the middle of the thicket, as far as she could go. She remembers scaring a few snakes away.
Oh, boy.
and because they were running from the storm as well.
Sure.
So they crawled into the middle of the thicket and just waited there for the storm, for the wind to blow by them. The tornado, the funnel itself never got really close, but the wind was still strong. And she said along that river bank, creek bank, there were big trees that broke off because of the wind. Their branches broke off. But the thicket, bent and swayed with the wind, but didn't break. And so they were safe in that thicket. And I'm trying, and over the years, I tried to figure out when that might have been. If she was born in around 1880, and she was 5 or 6 at the time, that was like in 1885, 1886. So those kind of stories not only take you back in time, but they tell you the kind of experiences that they had and what they thought. And those are really the foundations of identity, really, And the one thing another story is that my maternal grandmother, the one who raised me, had a younger sister. And there are two parts of this story. My grandmother's name was Nellie. She was the older of the two. And her sister's name was Emma. She was 2 years younger. And this part of the story occurred when it was 1918 in the Spanish flu epidemic. I'm sure you've heard about that, the worldwide pandemic that's like we're having now, but it was Spanish flu. And my grandmother's younger sister, Emma, caught the flu, Spanish flu. Eventually she died. But she lingered for a while before she died. And my grandmother and her mother took care of her, tended to try to, get her well, but they took care of her. And she got worse and worse as time went on. The days went by until she died. And the one thing I remember about her telling the story is that every time after she told the story, she would cry, because to her it was just like it was yesterday. And she felt the same kind of grief. And I could see that the memory was still painful for her, and that she still grieved for her younger sister. So I always remember that, because that tells me something about my grandmother. And a couple years before that, their father died. So they had to go to the Rosebud Agency, where Rosebud, South Dakota is now, because he willed them his land. So they had to go to the agency to sign something so that the title deed to the land could be in their name. When he got there, and keep in mind, one was Nellie, one was Emma, Good Voice Eagle. And when they got there, this white male who was working in the office, who was doing the transaction for them, for whatever reason, decided to give them different names. Where he got the authorization, or where he felt that he had the right to do that, who knows. But since he was a government official and he made the change, it was official. It was legal. So my grandmother Nellie became Annie. Annie Nellie Good Voice Eagle. And my grandmother Emma became Fanny. Fanny Emma Good Voice Eagle. That's what he put on the deed to their land. So they had no choice after that but to use those names.
Yeah.
So I could tell that, I could feel my grandmother's frustration when she would tell that story. Oh, why would this white guy do this to us? Well, we didn't like those names. But for the rest of her life, she had to use the word, name Annie,
Right.
even though her name was Nellie. So when you hear stories like that, it makes them real.
Mm-hmm.
It brings home to you, at least to me it did, about how they function in one given moment in their lives. And that says something about their character and the kind of people they were. So those are the kind of stories you need to look for. Those are the kinds of stories that empower or will give you your sense of identity and empower who you are as an individual. So the more of those kind of stories you can find and come across, that's what we need.
Right. And are those stories written down? Have you
Yeah.
written those down?
I have written
Yeah.
those stories down.
And I love that, because we talked several times about distractions
Right.
in the world the way it works now. We're not
Yes.
sitting around campfires with our grandchildren
No.
or our kids very often. It just
No.
doesn't happen that way.
Right.
And if you have books, if you journals, whatever it looks like, in your case,
Yes.
published books, and I have my two uncles and my father have all made a living in writing stories in the state, and my aunt now has a couple of books that she's published as well.
Right. Yes.
And they almost all are focused on family stories that get passed down.
Sure.
And a lot of times you can't sit down and share those stories anymore.
Right.
But when the time is right, and your grandchild, and you said you have
Right.
16, right?
Yes.
When they find that book at the right time in their life and they're able to read those stories, it's such a powerful thing.
It is. It can be.
Yeah. Joseph, once again, thank you for joining us
My
here
pleasure.
at Hochoka, at the center of St. Joseph's Indian School campus, where we talk about issues that are central to Native America today. Until next time, stay centered.